The reproductive system, part 2, the reproductive system of the female. So the female reproductive system is going to, in general, produce sex hormones and functional gametes. It will protect and support a developing embryo, nourish a newborn infant, and the main organs we will be going over today are the ovaries, uterine tubes, also known as fallopian tubes, uterus, vagina, and the external genitalia. So looking at the overall cross-section through the female reproductive system, one of the first things I want to point out is that the reproductive system of the female, unlike the reproductive system of the male, does not share anything with the urinary system. If you recall, in the male, the urethra is used for urination and also ejaculation. In the female, we can see the bladder and then the urethra, which is entirely separate from the uterus, cervix, and vagina. So let's start going through some of the individual parts of the female reproductive system, and then we will talk about the cycles. So the ovaries, uterine tubes, and the uterus are enclosed in what is called a broad ligament. The uterine tubes run along this broad ligament, and then they open up into the pelvic cavity lateral to the ovaries. So let's take a look at that so we can get a visual. So here is the uterus. You can see that it is pear-shaped, kind of like an upside down pear. So the biggest part at the top, smallest part down here at the bottom. Here is our uterine or fallopian tube, the ovary, and then this big thing here that almost looks like a wing, this is the broad ligament. And the broad ligament is going to attach to the uterine tube. As you can see here, it kind of runs along the broad ligament. We've got some other connective tissues involved as well, though. So the ovaries are small almond-shaped organs near the lateral walls of the pelvic cavity. And the main function of the ovaries is to produce the oocytes, which are the immature female gametes. We will also have the secretion of the female sex hormones, specifically estrogen and progesterone. And we'll talk more about what those do as we go through the rest of the chapter. The mesovarium is a type of mesentery this is a thickened mesentery that will support and stabilize the position of each of the ovaries. We've also got an ovarian ligament that will attach the ovary to the uterus, suspensory ligaments that will go from the ovary to the pelvic wall, and along this we will see the ovarian artery and the ovarian vein, and these vessels will connect to the ovary at what we call the ovarian hilum. So let's see if we can take a look at those in a picture as well. So let's go forward here. So again, we've got the broad ligament, which was the big wing we talked about. And above the broad ligament, you can see the mesovarium here. We've got the ovarian ligament, which is going to attach the ovary to the uterus. Then we can see the suspensory ligament. So that's what this is, the suspensory ligament, which goes from the ovary and attaches into the inside of the pelvic cavity. So the three of these really give a lot of structure and support to the uterus and the fallopian or uterine tubes, as well as the ovary. So the ovaries, if we delve into them just a little bit more, they are going to have their own visceral peritoneum, which is the covering on the outside of the ovary, also called the germinal epithelium. It covers the surface and overlies the tunica albuginea. Now, if you just watch the male reproductive system, you've already heard of that membrane before. The tunica albuginea covered the testes as well. It's also going to consist of columnar epithelial cells. So recall columnar, column or rectangular in shape, the cells, epithelial being cells that line or cover all body surfaces. The stroma is the interior tissue of the ovary, and it's got a superficial cortex, so this is what we're going to find on the outside, and a deeper medulla, which is what we're going to find on the inside. The gametes are produced in the cortex, or that outer edge. Okay, so looking at this ovary, we can't see the inside of it in this view, but the idea is we've got a covering over it, the germinal epithelium, and then underneath that we have the tunica albuginea. Then we have the interior tissue of the ovary, which is going to be the cortex, that's the outer edge of the ovary, and then the medulla, which is the middle or center of the ovary. And the gametes, the oocytes, are going to be produced in that cortex. The uterine tubes are also called fallopian tubes or oviducts. They are hollow, muscular tubes and are only about 13 centimeters long. Their primary function is to transport that oocyte to the uterus, and this is going to happen when the oocyte has been ovulated. So once it actually emerges from that ovary, it needs to travel down the fallopian tube towards the uterus, where it may or may not become fertilized. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later, and then in more detail in chapter 29, which is the chapter on fertilization and pregnancy. So focusing on the uterine tubes a little bit more, we have three main segments of the uterine tubes. We have the infundibulum, which is the kind of an expanded in, sort of funnel-shaped near the ovary that has finger-like projections on it called fimbriae. And the inner surface of this part of the fallopian tube is lined with cilia, which, remember, are the little hairs that are going to sweep fluids across the cell surface. The ampulla is the middle segment. And here we've got some thicker muscle layers. And the isthmus is the short segment between the ampulla and the uterine wall. So let's look at those regions. So here's our uterus. Remember the upside down pear. We've got an ovary on both sides. We can see the mesovarium peeking through here and the ovarian ligament. There's the suspensory ligament we talked about before as well. And then here is our fallopian tube or uterine tube. So the very end of it is the infundibulum. It's kind of opens up a bit here, and there are finger-like projections called fimbriae there on the infundibulum. Then we have the middle section, which is the ampulla. It's a bit more muscular, and of course we're talking about smooth muscle here. And then the isthmus, which is the region closest to the uterus. So the functional anatomy of the uterine tube, we're going to see that the uterine tube is lined with epithelium, and specifically the epithelium is going to be ciliated columnar epithelial cells. So we've got cilia and we're columnar in shape. There is also scattered mucin secreting cells here as well. The mucosa is going to be surrounded by concentric layers of smooth muscle, which we know is involuntary. And this is going to be important as we are attempting to transport the oocyte from the ovary to the uterus. We're going to need peristaltic or squeezing contractions of those fallopian tubes to get that oocyte to move forward. So with the cilia and the peristalsis, we're really going to be able to move that oocyte forward. So here's a zoomed in view of the microvilli of the mucin secreting cells, and also the cilia, or the hair-like projections that we're going to find lining the inside of the fallopian tube. So the uterine tube and fertilization, which again we're going to talk about a lot more in chapter 29. We're focusing really on preparing for fertilization in chapter 28. So for fertilization to occur, a secondary oocyte, which we haven't talked about yet, so if you don't know what that is, just hold that thought, we'll get to it. A secondary oocyte must meet a sperm within the first 12 to 24 hours it ends up in the uterine tube. So there's a very small window of fertilization opportunity. It's typically going to happen near the boundary between the ampulla and isthmus. So the biggest thing you should be taking from this is that fertilization must happen in the fallopian tube. It doesn't happen in the uterus. It's got to happen in the fallopian tube. There are cells called PEG cells in the epithelium of the fallopian tube that will create or secrete a fluid that helps to complete capacitation of sperm. We talked about that a little bit in the male reproductive portion, but capacitation is what's really going to get the sperm fully mature, moving, and ready to go so that we can have fertilization. They're also going to supply nutrients to the sperm and the pre-embryo should there be one. The uterus is going to provide for the developing embryo, which we call it an embryo from week 1 to 8, and then call it a fetus week 9 through delivery. The uterus is going to mechanically support, nutritionally support, and remove waste for the developing embryo and fetus. Again, it's pear-shaped. We talked about that, like an upside-down pear. And some of the main features of the uterus we should talk about as well. The uterine body is the largest portion of the uterus, and it's going to end at what's called the isthmus, which is the constricted area of the uterus. So let's go through these terms, and then I will show you an image, and we'll review them using the image. The fundus is the rounded portion of the uterine body that is superior to where the uterine tubes attach. Kind of like the fundus in the stomach sort of raises up, if you remember that back in the digestive chapter. The cervix is the inferior or bottommost portion of the uterus. It extends from the isthmus to the vagina, and the distal end, or the far end of the cervix, will project about 1.25 centimeters into the vaginal canal. There is an external os, which is an opening in the cervix that's surrounded by the distal end of the cervix, leading into the cervical canal. And the cervical canal is the constricted passageway opening to the uterine cavity and internal os. Okay, so let's see what some of that stuff is. So first of all, we're kind of looking at an edge of the uterus here. We can't really see the whole thing in this view, but we can flip to see the rest of it. So just reviewing some of the main components. This is going to represent the body of the uterus, which is the largest portion of the uterus, so the bulk of it. Then up here we have kind of a little bump or a little hump that goes up above the fallopian tubes. That is the fundus of the uterus. As the uterus starts to go down through this body area, you can see it begins to get smaller and more constricted, a little bit more pinched in. This is the isthmus of the uterus, where it gets a little bit smaller. At the very bottom of the uterus, this rounded cap on the end of the uterus, this is known as the cervix. And you can see that the cervix does, in fact, extend into the vaginal canal. So here's the vaginal canal, and you can see that the cervix kind of balloons out into the vaginal canal. The opening into the cervix is known as the external os, the external os. After we go through the external os, we have the cervical canal, and then what's known as the internal os. So an os is an opening. This is the external os, and this is the internal os. And the internal os is what leads to the uterine cavity. So that would be the lumen or hollow inside of the uterus. We also have a review here, which is nice, of the uterine tube regions. So if those are starting to get a little rusty, you can look at those here as well. And over here is a great review of the ligaments, mesovarium, and the broad ligament that we talked about as well. So that's a really good summary picture. So if we were to look at the uterine wall specifically, if we were to cut a chunk out of the uterine wall and examine the layers in the uterine wall, we would see three distinct layers in the uterine wall. We have the perimetrium, which is the outermost layer of the uterus. It's an incomplete serous membrane that joins with the peritoneal lining of the abdomen, covers the fundus and the posterior surface of the uterine body and isthmus. We then have the myometrium, which is the middle layer, the thickest, and made of muscle, again, smooth muscle. The endometrium, which is the innermost layer of the uterus, it's thin and very glandular, so lots of glands, lots of secretions. So we're going to look at those three layers in a little bit more detail. But before we do that, let's go back to this image to see where we're talking about these layers. And then we're going to zoom in on the layers as well as we go. So here we would see the perimetrium. This is the outermost layer. Then we've got our thickest layer, the myometrium, smooth muscle. And then the lining, which we would call the endometrium. Okay, so let's talk about what each one of those is all about. So the perimetrium was the outermost covering we touched on. The myometrium is the thickest portion of the uterine wall, again, made of smooth muscle, constitutes about 90% of the mass of the uterus. This muscle, this thick muscle, will actually provide the force we need to move the fetus from the uterus into the vaginal canal during childbirth. The endometrium, or the lining of the uterus, will contribute about 10% of the mass of the uterus, and it's very glandular. There's glandular and vascular, so blood vessel tissues, support physiological demands of the growing fetus, so that if the uterus does in fact sustain a pregnancy, then the endometrium will be very integral in that process. There are many uterine glands in the endometrium that open onto the endometrial surface and extend deep down into the mucosa, directly into the lamina propria, which is a layer of connective tissue under the mucosal lining. Estrogen causes the uterine glands, blood vessels, and the epithelium to change monthly. And we're going to talk about that cycle also soon. So here is a zoomed in view of the uterine wall. You can see a little bit better. So this would be the lumen or the uterine cavity. Endometrium here in purple. You can see the deep uterine glands, which will be producing secretions. Blood vessels, very rich in blood supply, little spiral blood vessels. And then we've got the myometrium, which is the thick, smooth muscle, and the perimetrium, which is the outermost covering. So in the endometrium, we have two layers within it. We have the functional layer, which is where the uterine glands are located, and this is the thicker of the two layers, and it's the one that's going to undergo dramatic changes in thickness and structure during the uterine cycle. And the uterine cycle is, we're talking specifically about menses, or the process of bleeding and rebuilding this functional layer. The basal layer is going to attach the endometrium to the myometrium and contains the terminal branches of the tubular uterine glands, so the tail end of the tubular uterine glands. There will be changes in the endometrium, again, during the menses phase, and then on from there, we'll talk about soon. The basal layer remains relatively constant, but the functional layer will undergo cyclical changes in response to sex hormone levels, which will produce specific features of the uterine cycle. So we're going to come back to the uterine cycle and talk about it a little bit more, as well as the ovarian cycle. So that's going to come up once we finish talking about the anatomy, which we're still going through now. The vagina is an elastic muscular tube that extends between the cervix and the vestibule. It's 7.5 to 9 centimeters long and highly distendable, which means that it will stretch. 3 functions: passageway for elimination of menstrual fluid, receives the sperm during sexual intercourse, and forms the inferior portion of the birth canal. The cervix, as we saw previously, will project into the vaginal canal, and then we have an area called the vaginal fornix, which is a shallow recess surrounding where the cervix protrudes into the vaginal canal. So let's go forward a little bit to look at that in an image. So here is the bottom of the uterus. This is the cervix. And then we've got the external os that we already looked at. Here's the vaginal canal. And then where the vaginal canal ends and opens up to the outside of the body, this area is called the vestibule, which we just mentioned. In the vaginal canal, we can also see these wavy bumps called rugae, and they serve the same purpose that they did in the stomach. Rugae is extra tissue for expansion, which is going to be important for stretching during childbirth. Around the neck of the cervix, where the cervix protrudes into the vaginal canal, is the vaginal fornix that we just mentioned previously. So let's talk about the histology of the vagina. So the vaginal wall is going to contain networks of blood vessels and layers of smooth muscle as well, and it is moistened by secretions of the cervical glands. Water also moves across the permeable epithelium to produce vaginal fluid. The vaginal epithelia is non-keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelia, and has folds in it, which we just mentioned, the rugae. The vaginal mucosa is surrounded by an elastic muscular layer, again smooth muscle fibers, arranged in a circular and longitudinal bundle. It's continuous with the uterine myometrium. So in the vaginal canal are also harmless resident bacteria that are always there. They're supported by nutrients in the cervical mucus, and their job is to create an acidic environment, which is very healthy for the vaginal canal because it will restrict growth of many types of pathogens. Vaginitis is inflammation of the vagina that can be caused by fungi, bacteria, or parasites. And a vaginal smear is a diagnostic test that will sample epithelial cells at the surface of the vaginal canal and can tell us about the stages of ovarian and uterine cycles. The external genitalia is going to include the vulva, which is the area containing the female external genitalia. So that's a general term for all of the external parts. The vestibule is the space bounded by small folds known as the labia minora, covered with smooth, hairless skin, and the urethra opens into the vestibule in front of the vaginal entrance. We're going to look at images of this as well, just to be sure that we know where everything is technically located. The urethral glands discharge into the urethra near the external opening of the urethra, and the clitoris is a small projection in the vestibule that is derived from the same embryonic structures as the penis. The corpus cavernosum of the clitoris forms the body. Vestibular glands include the lesser and the greater vestibular glands. The lesser vestibular glands will secrete onto the exposed surface of the vestibule, and the greater vestibular glands will secrete into the vestibule near the vaginal opening during sexual arousal. So let's review some of these features we just talked about. So again, we have the vaginal canal here, cervix, external os. Here's our uterus, ovary, fallopian tube or uterine tube. Down at the bottom of the vaginal canal, there's the greater vestibular gland. And then here's the bladder and the urethra. And around the urethra, we have the urethral glands. Clitoris, labia minora, labia majora. Okay, transitioning into the breast, also known as the mammary glands, and again, we'll visit them again in chapter 29 when we talk about pregnancy and lactation. The mammary glands are specialized organs of the integumentary system that produce milk, known as lactation, to nourish the infant. They're controlled by hormones, and they contain a good bit of pectoral adipose tissue or fat. The nipple contains ducts of the mammary glands, and the areola is the reddish-brown skin around each nipple. The mammary gland is going to consist of lobes, and these lobes will contain secretory lobules separated by dense connective tissue. So this is where milk production would happen under stimulation of lactation hormones. The mammary gland ducts will leave the lobules and converge to form a lactiferous duct in each lobe. The lactiferous ducts will form an expanded chamber called the sinus, and 15 to 20 of them will open up to each nipple. So let's take a look at these features in this next image. So here's our pectoralis major muscle, and then the pectoral fat pad or adipose tissue on top of the muscle. You can see these lobules of the mammary gland, and the lobules will empty into the lactiferous ducts and then the sinus out through the nipple. Areola, nipple. So let's move into oogenesis, which is one of the two cycles we're going to talk about. And oogenesis is ovum production. It's going to begin before birth, so this is different than it is in males. So in males, sperm production is going to occur later, but in women, this is going to begin before birth. It'll accelerate at puberty and end at menopause. The female ovaries contain oogonia, which are female reproductive stem cells. So their job is to undergo mitosis, and they will produce diploid primary oocytes, or oocytes, and that means the full complement of the human DNA. So we'll have 46 chromosomes in these oocytes, which is not where we want to be. So we start there, but we need to whittle that down to 23, or half the human complement, so that when the egg meets the sperm, together they make 46. So at birth, ovaries contain approximately 2 million primary oocytes already when you are a newborn baby. Most will degenerate in a process called atresia. Those that will survive will remain at prophase 1 until we reach puberty. So by the time we get to puberty, we've got about 400,000 primary oocytes left. Some are stimulated to finish meiosis 1, producing haploid secondary oocytes. Haploid is what we want. That's half the human chromosome number, so that's going to be 23 chromosomes. So let's look a little bit more detail of how we get to this. So the cytoplasm of a primary oocyte divides unevenly, producing one secondary oocyte with most of the original cytoplasm, and 2 or 3 polar bodies that will disintegrate. The ovary will release this secondary oocyte, which will be suspended in metaphase 2. Meiosis 2 is completed when the oocyte is fertilized. When it becomes fertilized, we then call it a mature ovum. Primary oocytes remain in suspended development until puberty. At puberty, rising FSH, remember that means follicle stimulating hormone. Rising follicle stimulating hormone will trigger the start of the ovarian cycle. Each month thereafter, some primary oocytes are stimulated to develop further. Ovarian follicles are structures that are specialized in the cortex of the ovaries, where oocyte growth and meiosis 1 occur. Primary oocytes are located in the outer part of the ovarian cortex in little clusters called egg nests. Primordial ovarian follicles, so primordial meaning been there since the beginning of your time. The primary oocyte and its surrounding follicle cells is considered the primary or primordial ovarian follicle. The primary ovarian follicle will be formed from an activated primordial ovarian follicle. So I'm going to show you a picture of this. It starts to get a little bit confusing. The zona pellucida is an area around the oocyte where the microvilli of the follicle cells and the surface of the oocyte interact. Now this is good because the follicle will I like to think of it as baby the oocyte, take care of it, nourish it, baby it as it prepares to possibly be released. Okay, so let's take a look at this picture for a minute. So this is basically what we just looked at in the last slide. These are the primordial ovarian follicles. And so it's a little hard to see, but here are the primary oocytes. Okay, and you can see multiple in this picture, and then around them are the follicle cells. And remember, I just mentioned that the follicle cells have little microvilli that interact with the primary oocyte. So they're interacting with each other. The follicle is looking after each of these oocytes. So the primary oocytes are located in the outer portion of the ovarian cortex. So that's what we're looking at here up really close. We're in the outer edges of the ovary in the cortex. And remember, we call these egg nests. So a single layer of follicle cells will surround each primary oocyte within the egg nest, and we can see that in this image. The primary oocyte and its follicle cells form together what we call a primordial ovarian follicle, which is the title of this image. So at puberty, each ovary contains about 200,000 of these primordial follicles. Beginning at puberty, primordial ovarian follicles are continuously activated to join other follicles already in development. The activated primordial ovarian follicle will either eventually mature and release in the process we call ovulation, or it will degenerate in the process we call atresia. Okay, so here we have the formation of the primary ovarian follicle. So follicle development will begin with the activation of a primordial ovarian follicle that we just looked at, and it will activate into a primary ovarian follicle, which is what we're looking at now. The follicular cells around the oocytes will begin to divide and form several layers of cells around the growing primary oocyte. So we can see two primary oocytes in this image here. So the follicular cells are getting a little bit more noticeable around each egg. The cells begin to produce sex hormones called estrogens. Microvilli from the surrounding follicle cells will intermingle with the microvilli originating at the surface of the oocyte. This region is called the zona pellucida, which we mentioned before. The microvilli will increase the surface area available for the transfer of materials from the follicular cells to the oocyte. So remember, we're babying, we're taking care of these oocytes, we're getting them ready for the possibility of release. The secondary ovarian follicle will form from the primary ovarian follicle. Then the tertiary ovarian follicle will form after that. So we're going to look at a picture of the secondary follicle first, and then we'll come back to tertiary. So many primordial ovarian follicles will develop into primary ovarian follicles, but only a few will mature further in the next 4 months or so. This process is under the control of a growth factor produced by the oocyte. The transformation will begin as the wall of the follicle thickens. At this stage, the complex is known as a secondary ovarian follicle. The primary oocyte continues to grow slowly. So in this image, we can still see the primary oocyte. We can see the zona pellucida where the follicle is in touch with the oocyte, nourishing it and babying it. And from here, we will go to the tertiary ovarian follicle. And in the tertiary ovarian follicle, we're going to see follicular fluid accumulate between the inner and outer cellular layers of the follicle. And this is going to become quite large. It's going to be twice the size of the secondary ovarian follicle that we just looked at. So before we look at an image of the tertiary follicle, which is coming, we're now talking about the ovarian cycle. And the ovarian cycle is a monthly process of maturation, ovulation, which is the release of the egg, and degeneration of the tertiary ovarian follicle. And it's going to be divided into two phases, the follicular phase and the luteal phase. Now, you've heard before that a typical average female ovarian cycle is 28 days. All women are not exactly the same on that. Some may be irregular, some may be longer than 28 days or shorter, but we're going to work with the average just to keep everything nice and organized. So 28-day cycle divided into the follicular phase, which is about the first 2 weeks-ish of that 28 days. Right in the middle, we're going to have ovulation, which is the release of the egg. And then after ovulation, we will have the luteal phase. So let's kind of go back to that tertiary ovarian follicle. So we are in the follicular phase or pre-ovulatory phase of the ovarian cycle, which is the first anywhere between 1 to 13-ish days, and again that's variable, leading up to ovulation. The tertiary ovarian follicle will create a bulge in the ovary, and the oocyte and its follicular cells will project into the antrum, which is the central chamber of the follicle, and I will show you this in an image shortly. It is surrounded by granulosa cells, and cells in the adjacent ovarian stroma will form a layer of thecal endocrine cells that will make estrogen. Rising levels of LH will prompt completion of meiosis 1. Now remember back from chapter 18 that LH is luteinizing hormone, and one of the very important things that it does is causes ovulation, which is again the release of the egg. The corona radiata is granulosal cells that will stay with the secondary oocyte, which we will mention again in chapter 29 as we talk about fertilization. So here is the tertiary ovarian follicle. So you can see that the follicle wall has continued to grow, and the deeper follicular cells begin secreting follicular fluid. So here is the oocyte, which is now, we call it secondary. And then this big thing here is the follicle, and you can see how swollen it has become. It is full of fluid, all this follicular fluid here. The secondary ovarian follicle has doubled in size and is now called a tertiary ovarian follicle. And it will continue to grow and accumulate follicular fluid leading up until the time when we actually have release of this in the process of ovulation. So ovulation is when the tertiary follicle will rupture and release the secondary oocyte into the pelvic cavity. The oocyte will then move into the uterine tube by contact with fimbriae or by fluid currents. The ovarian follicles that started but did not complete development will undergo atresia. So here is the ovary, and you can see the phases we've started going through that we're talking about separately. So here is the primordial ovarian follicles that develop into primary ovarian follicles and primary oocytes, secondary ovarian follicle and primary oocyte, and then here is our tertiary ovarian follicle, which is big, swollen, and full of fluid. And we're getting ready to release this little guy, which is going to be called the secondary oocyte. So at this point, we are at the phase of ovulation. So ovulation is the rupturing of that tertiary follicle, and we are going to spill out that secondary oocyte into the pelvic cavity. You can also see fluid rushing out. You can see some cells that are staying around the egg, and that again is going to be called the corona radiata, which will stay with the egg or oocyte. So once the follicle releases the oocyte, as we mentioned, the follicular contents, including the egg, will spill out into the pelvic cavity, and at this time, the egg will then move into the fallopian tube by contact with those little finger-like projections called fimbriae. They begin to create sort of a suction that will pull the egg in like a little vacuum. And then the fluid currents produced by the cilia in the uterine tubes will continue to move the oocyte toward the uterus. So once the egg is ovulated, which is going to be around day 14 on average of our 28-day cycle, following the ovulation, we then have what's called post-ovulatory phase or luteal phase. And this is when the corpus luteum develops. So the corpus luteum is going to form from the remaining granulosa cells under stimulation of LH. It's yellow because of the cholesterol it contains. And the cholesterol will be converted to progesterone, which will prepare the uterus for pregnancy. It will also secrete moderate amounts of estrogen and begins degenerating about 12 days after ovulation. So let's go back. Here is the corpus luteum. So the empty tertiary ovarian follicle will collapse, ruptured vessels will bleed into the antrum, and under the stimulation of LH, the remaining granulosa cells will invade the area and form this, the corpus luteum. The cholesterol in the corpus luteum is used to manufacture the steroid hormone progesterone. And progesterone is a big deal because its main job is going to be to prepare the uterus for pregnancy. So that little egg is floating down the fallopian tube, heading toward the uterus where it may or may not become fertilized. So if it does become fertilized, it needs to have a rich uterine lining to incorporate into and begin growing, forming the embryo. So the corpus luteum is going to make sure that that happens by producing progesterone, which will stimulate the uterine lining to produce a thicker lining rich with blood and nutrients so that it's ready for a possible pregnancy. The corpus albicans is produced from non-functional corpus luteum as fibroblasts invade and form scar tissue. This will mark the end of the ovarian cycle. So that is this. So the corpus luteum will begin to degenerate after about 12 days after ovulation unless the egg is fertilized. If the egg is fertilized, then it's going to hang around longer. But if the egg is not fertilized, then the progesterone and estrogen levels will begin to take a nosedive because the corpus luteum will begin to disintegrate. This is the corpus albicans, which is a disintegrated corpus luteum. The disintegration of this corpus luteum will mark the end of the ovarian cycle, and then a new ovarian cycle begins with another group of tertiary ovarian follicles. So this is just going to continue on and on throughout the duration of viable reproductive age. So the uterine cycle, also known as the menstrual cycle, is a repeating series of changes in the endometrium that last from 21 to 35 days. We said previously that we're going with the average, which is 28 days. Menarche is your first uterine cycle beginning at puberty, typically age 11 to 12, though it will vary. Menopause is the termination of the uterine cycle, or when it stops, between the ages of 45 and 55. The uterine cycle has 3 phases: the menstrual phase, the proliferative phase, the secretory phase. The menstrual and proliferative phase will occur during ovarian follicular phase, and the secretory phase will occur during the ovarian luteal phase. So let's talk about the menstrual phase. So the menstrual phase is the degeneration of the endometrial functional layer, which occurs in patches. This leads to the bleeding process known as menstruation or menses, and it's caused by the constriction of the spiral arteries, which will reduce blood flow, oxygen, and nutrients to the endometrium. This will cause the weakened arterial walls to rupture and release blood into the connective tissues of the functional layer. The entire functional layer will be lost through the external os and vagina, Only the functional layer is affected. The deeper basal layers are supplied by straight arteries. This lasts 1 to 7 days, and 35 to 50 milliliters of blood are lost. Dysmenorrhea is painful menstruation, and there can be several causes for that. So here is an image of a uterus in the menstrual phase, or menses. You can see that this would mean active bleeding. So the endometrial tissue is being sloughed off because there is no pregnancy, so there's no reason to keep that nutrient-rich lining. It's too much effort, too much work for the body. So the menstrual phase, we're sloughing off the endometrial tissue and blood. The proliferative phase is when we have epithelial cells of the uterine glands will begin to rebuild. So after we bleed, then we rebuild. Multiply and spread across the endometrial surface to restore the integrity of the uterine epithelium. Further growth and vascularization will completely restore the functional layer. This will happen at the same time as the enlargement of the tertiary ovarian follicles. This will be stimulated and sustained by estrogen secreted by the developing ovarian follicles. The entire functional layer is very vascular. Small arteries will spiral toward the inner surface from larger arteries in the myometrium. Okay, so in this image we can see proliferation happening. So this is after bleeding, where we're starting to rebuild for a new cycle. Here is the myometrium, and then above we have the endometrium. You can see that it is getting thicker again. The uterine glands are producing nutrients, and we've got blood vessels developing, and the endometrium is getting thicker and thicker to prepare for another chance at possible pregnancy. Secretory phase, the uterine glands enlarge, increasing their rates of secretion. Arteries will elongate and spiral through the functional layer. This begins at ovulation and will persist as long as the corpus luteum remains intact and is producing progesterone. Secretion will peak at about 12 days after ovulation and generally will last about 14 days, ending as the corpus luteum stops producing hormones. So once it is determined that there is no pregnancy and the corpus luteum disintegrates and there is no more progesterone, then we begin menses again. So here is the secretory phase, where the endometrial lining is at its thickest. You can see the spiral arteries and the glands very clearly in this image, where we are extremely nutrient filled, very vascular, ready for a possible implantation or pregnancy. But again, if that doesn't occur, then we just cycle back to menses. The female reproductive cycle is controlled by hormones of the pituitary gland and gonads. There is a complex pattern that will coordinate the ovarian and uterine cycles that we just went over. The increased frequency of pulses of gonadotropin-releasing hormone will stimulate luteinizing hormone secretion. Around day 10 of the ovarian cycle, the effect of estrogen on luteinizing hormone secretion will change from inhibition to stimulation. This occurs when levels of estrogen exceed the threshold value for about 36 hours. Around day 14, there will be a massive release of luteinizing hormone from the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. This makes sense because this is when we want ovulation to occur. The sudden surge of LH concentration will trigger the completion of meiosis I by the primary oocyte, the rupture of the follicular wall, and ovulation. Ovulation occurs about 34 to 38 hours after LH surge begins. and about 9 hours after the LH peak. Hormonal regulation of the follicular phase, FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone, stimulates follicular development. That makes sense. Monthly, some tertiary ovarian follicles begin to grow. Estradiol is the most abundant estrogen and has the most pronounced effects on target tissues. It's the dominant hormone prior to ovulation. There are 5 main functions of estrogen. It will stimulate bone and muscle growth, maintain female secondary sex characteristics, like the distribution of body hair and adipose tissue. It can affect the central nervous system activity, specifically in the hypothalamus, where estrogen increases sexual drive. It maintains functional accessory reproductive glands and organs, and will also initiate the repair and growth of the endometrium. Hormonal regulation of the luteal phase. High LH levels will promote progesterone secretion, and we talked about how that will thicken the uterine lining. This will trigger formation of the corpus luteum, and a low frequency of gonadotropin-releasing hormone will stimulate LH secretion more than FSH secretion. LH will maintain the structure and the function of the corpus luteum. Progesterone levels will remain high for about 1 week unless pregnancy occurs. The corpus luteum begins to degenerate. Progesterone and estrogen levels drop. Gonadotropin-releasing hormone pulse frequency increases, which will stimulate follicle-stimulating hormone secretion, and the ovarian cycle will begin again. The hormonal regulation of the uterine cycle. Progesterone and estrogen levels decrease. As the corpus luteum degenerates, this results in menstruation because there's a lack of progesterone. Endometrial tissue will shed for several days until rising levels of estrogen will stimulate the regeneration of a new functional layer. The proliferative phase will continue until rising progesterone starts the secretory phase. An increase in estrogen and progesterone will cause enlargement of the uterine glands and an increase in secretory activity. So this is when our uterine lining is at its very thickest. I figure you guys are pretty knowledgeable about this by now in your lives, but we are going to go over the basics of sexual intercourse. So the autonomic nervous system will control the male and female reproductive systems. Sexual intercourse will introduce semen into the female reproductive tract. Male sexual function is coordinated by complex neural reflexes, sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Male sexual arousal will increase with parasympathetic stimulation over pelvic nerves. So again, the more relaxed, the better. This leads to an erection. The male sexual stimulation will initiate secretion from the bulbourethral glands. This lubricates the spongy urethra and the surface of the glands, or the head of the penis. This will lead to emission and ejaculation. Emission occurs under sympathetic stimulation, so fight or flight, excitable part of the autonomic nervous system. Peristaltic contractions of the ductus deferens will push seminal fluid and sperm into the prostatic urethra. Contractions in the seminal glands and prostate will move the seminal mixture along the urethra, and sympathetic contraction of the urinary bladder and the internal urethral sphincter will seal off the bladder so that semen does not go into the bladder. Ejaculation occurs with powerful rhythmic contractions, stiffens the penis, and pushes semen towards the external urethral opening. causes a sensation, and after orgasm, resolution phase will occur. Heart rate and blood pressure start to go down, blood begins to leave the erectile tissue, and detumescence is the process of losing an erection. Erectile dysfunction is also known as impotence, the inability to achieve or maintain an erection caused by physical or physiological factors. Female sexual function, parasympathetic activation will lead to engorgement of erectile tissues. In the clitoris specifically, increased secretion of cervical mucus glands and greater vestibular glands for lubrication. Blood vessels in the vaginal walls fill with blood, and fluid will move from the underlying connective tissue to the vaginal surfaces, again for lubrication. The effects of aging in the reproductive system. In the female reproductive system, the changes associated with menopause, and in the male reproductive system, there is a comparable age-related change that occurs gradually over a longer period of time, sometimes referred to as the male climacteric. The male climacteric is the period of declining reproductive function between the ages of 50 and 60. Testosterone begins to decrease. FSH and LH will increase. Sperm production continues. Sexual activity gradually decreases because a lot of times of the declining testosterone levels. Perimenopause is an interval immediately preceding menopause. The ovarian and uterine cycles start to become irregular due to the shortage of primordial ovarian follicles. Levels of estrogen decrease, and ovulation may not be triggered. Menopause is the time that ovulation and menstruation cease, typically around the ages of 45 to 55. By age 50, there are often no primordial ovarian follicles left. In premature menopause, depletion occurs before the age of 40. Circulating concentrations of estrogen and progesterone decline, and the production of gonadotropin-releasing hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone rises sharply. A decrease in levels of estrogen can lead to reductions in the size of the uterus and breasts, thinning of urethral and vaginal epithelia, and reduction in the rate of bone deposition. Normal human reproduction requires that in males, sperm count must be adequate. Semen must have the correct pH and nutrients, and erection and ejaculation must function properly. In females, the ovarian and uterine cycles must coordinate properly. Ovulation and oocyte transport must occur normally. The environment of the reproductive tract must support the survival and movement of sperm and the fertilization of the oocyte. That concludes Chapter 28, Female Reproductive System, Part 2, and I will see you guys again in Chapter 29 when we talk about the development of the embryo and fetus.